Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I'm the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. I'm also the host of the SERMAPod, and today we're dealing with an issue that is unfortunately very prevalent in our world, something we've covered extensively in SERMA, and we continue to cover as this topic evolves. It is coverage. The specific topic is abuse and sexual abuse claims, and today we'll be discussing coverage that is available for these type of claims with Marshall Gilinsky, who is a new SERMA member. He is a shareholder at Anderson Kill, joining us from New York today, I believe. Is that true, Marshall?
I'm in Boston today.
Boston today, home of the Celtics, my favorite team.
World champion Boston Celtics, yes.
World champion. Thanks for joining us today on the SERMAPod.
Happy to talk to you, Rich. Good to see you again.
So first of all, what kinds of coverage are available? I think a lot of people might not be aware that there is coverage for these kind of claims. So what kind of coverage are we talking about? And what kind of businesses are you seeing purchase this kind of coverage?
Yeah, there's standard types of coverage. And there's a number of, depending on the type of the claim and who the claimant is and the nature of the allegations that are made against the defendants, there's different type of coverages that can kick in. And we've helped lots of different clients over the years deal with these types of claims. And there are some cases where you have, GL coverage, which covers allegations of bodily injury. You also have D&O policies where, there's allegations that the company was acting wrongfully in the way it was conducting its business and not rooting out the types of problems that apparently were going on either with or without the company's knowledge. So if there's allegations made against directors or officers or with respect to the management of the company, D&O coverage, either individual or entity coverage, come into play there. If we're dealing with claims of employment-related harm, harassment or abuse, employment coverage comes into play there. And there are lots of instances where these different types of coverages overlap, and you put all of them on notice and you work it out from there. We've been involved in lots of cases where you end up getting contributions both from a D&O carrier and one of the others, whether it's employment or GL. But there's an instinct. I mean, these types of claims, whether it's sexual harassment on the one hand or abuse on the other hand, they're so delicate and they're so serious, and they're legitimately a cause for searching internally, right, and looking at the way that employees have behaved, and they're shameful ultimately. There's an instinct that happens to kind of curl up into a ball, right, and to just ignore it or make it go away. And I think that instinct, with so many as a human reactions to problems, is a counterproductive one. We found that the best way to react to these problems is to take a good, hard, steely look at what's going on and fix it and make it right. And insurance is part of that, right? There's insurance that's in place for all sorts of mistakes that happen, and while there's not insurance for intentionally harming other people, very rare. There's always people and entities that are on the defendant side of these types of claims that didn't intend to hurt anybody. Rather, they were negligent in overseeing what employees were doing or not paying close attention to things that were going on. And that type of accidental harm is exactly what insurance is for. So it's important to bring that into play.
Marshall, you mentioned a couple of different types of insurance. These are things that perhaps you and I deal with in our everyday practice, but some of our listeners and viewers might not be familiar with the different types. So you mentioned, for example, D&O. What is D&O insurance, and how does that apply to this scenario?
Yeah, so D&O coverage is a basic type of coverage that almost every company has. It protects the directors and officers individually in their, the work that they perform on behalf of the insured company. and usually it protects the entity itself against accusations that the directors or the company engaged in some sort of wrongful act. It's a very broadly defined term. The coverage is triggered pretty readily. There's exclusions oftentimes for a lot of things, but it's a basic type of corporate insurance coverage for stepping out of bounds in your duties on behalf of another.
And that's important, right? Because frequently in these allegations, the alleged victim, the plaintiff is not just alleging that they were the victim of an individual's harassment or abuse or assault, but they're obviously trying to bring other potential tortfeasors, other defendants in, and they're alleging that these directors and officers of a sports or entertainment organization were either directly responsible or negligent in failing to, safeguard them from this activity, right? That's why it's important for directors and officers to have this kind of coverage as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the worst cases are the ones where the abuser continued to act in a harmful fashion to people over an extended period of time, and when that type of situation arises, what you typically see is, from the victim side, who should have stopped this from happening sooner, before anything happened to me? If it happened to those other people and years later it happened to me, they ask themselves, who knew that this was going on, or who was in a position to know that this was going on, and who could or should have stopped it before anything happened to me, right? And that's where you get accusations that the board of directors should have known that the abuser was acting in this way and should have had controls in place to keep this type of thing from happening. And those accusations of mismanagement are the types of things that are commonly covered under the insurance policy.
And you mentioned, Marshall, that intentional acts are not covered. Explain that, please.
Yeah, there's an exclusion, and there's common sense. It's common sense to think of why these exclusions exist. There's exclusions that say if you intentionally harm someone, and there's also public policy in a lot of states as well, that says if you intentionally harm someone, you can't have insurance, right? So if the employee, or let's just say the director of a company, is physically assaulting employees of the company, right? It doesn't make sense to have insurance to protect that director from that intentional harm, right? Because that's not an accident, and that's ultimately what insurance is for, right? Insurance is for things that go wrong, and it's through some sort of oversight, negligence, maybe even recklessness, definitely recklessness, right? But when you go and shoot somebody, you don't have coverage for that, right? But typically in these cases, that you have as defendants the person who allegedly intentionally did something, and then the other people who were nearby and who weren't accused of having intentionally done anything, but who are alleged to have failed to stop something that they would or should have been able to.
You mentioned that one exclusion. What other common exclusions pertain to this kind of coverage?
There's a lot of policies have sexual abuse exclusions, right? Not all of them. There's also, we didn't mention this, but there's also separate lines of coverage for abuse, right? Like they're called like SAM policies, sexual abuse and molestation policies, that have their standalone separate premium just for that type of coverage. And a lot of, in youth sports, for example, for listeners of this podcast, it's not unusual for those types of organizations to buy that type of coverage, because it's not surprising to find an abuse and molestation exclusion in their general liability policy. So if you've got a really broad exclusion in your GL policy for abuse and molestation, it makes sense to consider buying the standalone SAM.
Now, you mentioned the idea that, these are claims that should be discussed out in the open, whereas frequently the tendency is to try to deal with them differently, deal with them more quietly, given the very sensitive nature of the claims and the victims. Explain that dynamic a little bit more and how that differs from your standard, policy where that maybe that apprehension doesn't exist.
Well, I think in a lot of businesses, companies, organizations, you want to get to the bottom of these types of things. If someone comes forward and says something terrible has happened to me in connection with one of your employees or volunteers or staff, whoever it is, right? It's not unusual to find that it's happened to a lot of people. It's actually it's the exception, not the rule, that someone comes forward and says, "Hey, back in 1987, Coach so and so did this to me." What you typically find is Coach so and so had problematic interactions with a lot, right? When something like that happens, typically what we see a lot of clients do is they hire a law firm. Not usually us, a different law firm that specializes in these claims of abuse or harassment, to do an internal investigation, to figure out what on earth was going on, who did this happen to, and is it true, right? And what do we do, and figure out what do we do to make it right. And that type of internal investigation, I think, is a standard approach for a lot of organizations that find themselves in this position. And I think it's a stand-up and appropriate response to getting to the bottom. It's a critical step in getting to the bottom of what has or hasn't happened and figuring out how to make it right. So those types of investigations are really important. And the insurance is part of that too, because the cost of conducting that investigation is a sensible response to these types of claims. In a way, it's a defense to these claims because it's important, if there are lawsuits that flow from this, it's important to show that you took it seriously and you did what you needed to do to figure out what was going on, as simply as a way of defending against the claims. It's not unusual that you're going to get to the bottom of it, find out what was going on, approach the victims in an effort to resolve the situation and compensate them, address their concerns, whatever the case may be. You'll do all of that, and still you'll have people who say, "No, I want to be in court. I want to make it public. I'm entitled to more than what you're suggesting." And in defending against those claims, it's very helpful to show that you took it as seriously as you did.
Marshall, speaking of compensation, one of the difficulties also in handling these kind of claims is just that, is determining once there is liability, what is the proper compensation mechanism? Because unlike, a standard personal injury or property damage claim where you could calculate what the damages are and, add some additional compensation for pain and suffering, loss of normal life, replacement costs, et cetera. That's not as easy to calculate, not as easy to quantify when you're dealing with claims of sexual harassment or sexual abuse. So in many ways, that adds to the difficulty in these kind of claims, right?
It's delicate, I'll say that, and it's very serious. And I think someone who suffers a serious workplace injury or just a bodily injury from an accident, right? All that's extremely serious too. Right? I've dealt with many cases over the years involving fatalities and life-changing injuries. All of that is incredibly serious, and the people who suffer from harassment or abuse suffer serious harm as well. So it's different, yes, but is it all something that we in this the people who work in this part of the world, or how do you compensate someone whose father is killed in an accident, right? That's unfathomable as well. So what does the law do, right? What do the practitioners do in those situations? They do the best they can. And the people who have experience doing it many times have a sense as to how you resolve it in a way that's fair, right?
Absolutely. You mentioned the delicate nature of these claims, sensitivity. It's very difficult, obviously, for, as we've seen, victims of sexual abuse, sexual harassment to come forward. Given that reluctance, what kind of response should carriers have that is different from your standard response. Of course, an insurance company has a job to do. They've got to investigate the claim and they've got to deny claims where appropriate. That's a little more complicated when you're dealing with someone whose life has been altered from these claims and has had difficulty coming forward for so many years, given what frequently happens when these victims do come forward. So that's a little bit different from your average claim as well, right?
Yeah, they are different, but there's different levels of skill and expertise that come along with the claims handlers who have worked on a lot of stuff. And I don't know that you'll necessarily find a dedicated professional or team of professionals at an insurance company that deal with only these claims. But I do know that there are lots of adjusters who have a lot of experience with these claims. And they can be really helpful, right? They understand the tact and diplomacy involved. They understand the seriousness of what's involved. And they've been down that road of figuring out how to adjust these losses, investigate the losses. I mean, it's not to say there aren't claimants out there who don't have merit to their claim. That does happen. So there's a certain amount of due diligence that goes into this, right? But the insurance professionals who have been around the block and know how to handle these claims, investigate and resolve these claims, can be very helpful to policyholders in leading the way and showing what sort of confirmation do we need to the accusations that are going on, and what sort of resolution is appropriate.
Marshall, last question or point of discussion perhaps for today is another reason these claims are rather unique, in addition to all of the reasons we've discussed, is that you're dealing with sports and entertainment, very high profile, very well-known policyholders frequently. The effect of these claims is frequently even greater when you're dealing with, some of the biggest brands in the world, coupled with the idea that, you're dealing with entities like coaches, trainers, teams that are dealing not just with, one potential victim, but masses, potentially, large groups, potentially class action, as we've seen in many examples. Michigan State, obviously, the Canadian Olympic hockey team. So you're dealing with, not just one claimant, but potentially many. That obviously adds to some of the challenges with these kind of claims.
Yeah. There's definitely a reputational and brand related issue that goes on here. And that's part of what insurance helps to protect. It's interesting. I've been in negotiations in those exact type of situations where we've seen insurance companies kind of approach the line to say, well, we'll want to put up some money to try and negotiate a settlement of this claim, but you've got part of what we're paying for here is the protection of your reputation. So why don't you put in some money too, right? And we've been successful in representing clients to push back on something like that, say, no, that's not the way this works. So part of the reason why we have insurance is to protect the full array of our exposure to harm from these types of claims. And that doesn't involve us chipping in to pay for what is insured and insurable loss. Protecting our reputation is part of what we pay for when we buy this type of insurance. And there's, over the years, we've found, I've developed a string site that helps to support that position. We've had success.
Very interesting stuff. Marshall Gilinsky, shareholder at Anderson Kill. For more information, visit andersonkill.com. Marshall, thanks for joining us in our organization. Thanks for sharing your insight today. And please come back and keep us posted on this very important subject.
Yeah, it's always great to see you and good to talk to you.